Good night, listener. Close your eyes and let me tell you tales to go to sleep by. And with every word you'll fall further under until you've slipped into silent slumber. The Little Gray Man. A nun, a countryman, and a blacksmith were once wandering through the world together. One day they lost their way in a thick, dark forest, and were thankful when they saw, in the distance, the walls of a house where they hoped they might obtain refuge for the night. When they got close to the house, they found that it was an old deserted castle, fast falling into ruins, but with some of the rooms still habitable. As they were homeless, they determined to take up their abode in the castle, and they arranged that one of them should always stay at home and keep house, while the other two went out in the world to seek their fortunes. The lot of remaining at home fell first to the nun, and when the countryman and the blacksmith had gone out to the wood, she set to work, tidied up the house, and prepared all the food for the day. As her companions did not come home for their midday meal, she ate up her own portion and put the rest in the oven to keep warm. Just as she was sitting down to sew, the door opened and a little gray man came in, and, standing before her, said, "Oh, how cold I am!" The nun was so very sorry for him, and said at once, "Sit down by the fire and warm yourself." The little man did as he was told, and soon called out, "Oh, how hungry I am!" The nun answered, "There is food in the oven. Help yourself." The little man did not need to be told twice, for he set to work and ate up everything with the greatest possible dispatch. When the nun saw this, she was very angry and scolded the dwarf because he had left nothing for her companions. The little man resented her words and flew into such a passion that he seized the nun, beat her, and threw her first against one wall and then the other. When he had nearly killed her, he left her lying on the floor and hastily walked out of the house. In the evening, the countryman and the blacksmith returned home, and when they found, on demanding their dinner, that there was nothing left for them, they reproached the nun bitterly and refused to believe her when she tried to tell them what had happened. The next day, the countryman asked to be left in charge of the house and promised that, if he remained home, no one should go hungry to bed. So the other two went out into the forest, and the countryman, having prepared the food for the day, ate up his own portion and put the rest in the oven. Just as he had finished clearing away, the door opened and the little gray man walked in, and this time he had two heads. He shook and trembled as before and exclaimed, "Oh, how cold I am!" The countryman, who was frightened out of his wits, begged him to draw near the fire and warm himself. Soon after, the dwarf looked greedily around and said, "Oh, how hungry I am!" "There is food in the oven, so you can eat," replied the countryman. Then the little man fell to with both his heads and soon finished the last morsel. When the countryman scolded him for this proceeding, he treated him exactly as he had done the nun, and left the poor fellow more dead than alive. Now when the blacksmith came home with the nun in the evening and found nothing for supper, he flew into a passion and swore that he would stay at home the following day and that no one should go supperless to bed. When day dawned, the countryman and the nun set out into the wood, and the blacksmith prepared all the food for the day as the others had done. Again the gray dwarf entered the house without knocking, and this time had 3 heads. When he complained of cold, the blacksmith told him to sit near the fire. And when he said he was hungry, the blacksmith put some food on a plate and gave it to him. The dwarf made short work of what was provided for him, and then, looking greedily around with his 6 eyes, he demanded more. When the blacksmith refused to give him another morsel, he flew into a terrible rage and proceeded to treat him in the same way as he had treated his companions. But the blacksmith was a match for him, for he seized a huge hammer and struck off 2 of the dwarf's heads with it. The little man yelled with pain and rage and hastily fled from the house. The blacksmith ran after him, and pursued him for a long way, but at last they came to an iron door, and through it the little creature vanished. The door shut behind him, and the blacksmith had to give up the pursuit and return home. He found that the nun and the countryman had come back in the meantime, and they were much delighted when he placed some food before them, and showed them the 2 heads he had struck off with his hammer. The 3 companions determined there and then to free themselves from the power of the Grey Dwarf, and the very next day they set to work to find him. They had to walk a long way, and to search for many hours, before they found the iron door through which the dwarf had disappeared, and when they had found it, they had the greatest difficulty in opening it. When at last they succeeded in forcing the lock, they entered a large hall, in which sat a young and lovely girl working at a table. The moment she saw the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman, she fell at her feet, thanking them with tears in her eyes for having set her free. She told them that she was a king's daughter, who had been shut up in the castle by a mighty magician. The day before, just about noon, she had suddenly felt the magic power over her disappear, and ever since that moment she had eagerly awaited the arrival of her deliverers. She went on to say that there was yet another princess shut up in the castle, who had also fallen under the might of the magician. They wandered through many halls and rooms till at last they found the second princess, who was quite as grateful as the first, and thanked the 3 companions most warmly for having set her free. Then the princesses told their rescuers that a great treasure lay hidden in the cellars of the castle, but that it was carefully guarded by a fierce and terrible dog. Nothing daunted, they all went down below at once, and found the fierce animal mounting guard over the treasure as the princesses had said. But one blow from the blacksmith's hammer soon made an end of the monster, and they found themselves in a vaulted chamber full of gold and silver and precious stones. Beside the treasure stood a young and handsome man, who advanced to meet them, and thanked the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman for having freed him from the magic spell he was under. He told him that he was a king's son, who had been banished to this castle by a wicked magician, and that he had been changed into a 3-headed dwarf. When he had lost 2 of his heads, the magic power over the 2 princesses had been removed, and when the blacksmith had killed the horrible dog, then he too had been set free. To show his gratitude, he begged the 3 companions to divide the treasure between them, which they did, but there was so much of it that it took a very long time. The princesses, too, were so grateful to their rescuers that one married the blacksmith and the other the countryman. Then the prince claimed the nun as his bride, and they all lived happily together till they died. The Moon. In days gone by there was a land where the nights were always dark, and the sky spread over it like a black cloth, for there the moon never rose, and no star shone in the obscurity. At the creation of the world, the light at night had been sufficient. 3 young fellows once went out of this country on a traveling expedition, and arrived in another kingdom where, in the evening, when the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, a shining globe was placed on an oak tree, which shed a soft light far and wide. By means of this, everything could very well be seen and distinguished, even though it was not so brilliant as the sun. The travelers stopped and asked a countryman, who was driving past with his cart, what kind of a light that was. "That is the moon," answered he. "Our mayor bought it for 3 thalers and fashioned it to the oak tree. He has to pour oil into it daily, and to keep it clean, so that it may always burn clearly. He receives a thaler a week from us for doing it." When the countryman had driven away, one of them said, "We could make some use of this lamp. We have an oak tree at home, which is just as big as this, and we could hang it on that. What a pleasure it would be not to have to feel about at night in the darkness." "I'll tell you what we'll do," said the second. "We will fetch a cart and horses and carry away the moon. The people here may buy themselves another. "I'm a good climber," said the third. "I will bring it down." The fourth brought a cart and horses, and the third climbed the tree, bored a hole in the moon, passed a rope through it, and let it down. When the shining ball lay in the cart, they covered it over with a cloth, that no one might observe the theft. They conveyed it safely into their own country and placed it on a high oak. Old and young rejoiced when the new lamp let its light shine over the whole land, and bedrooms and sitting rooms were filled with it. The dwarfs came forth from their caves in the rocks, and the tiny elves in their little red coats danced in rings on the meadows. The four took care that the moon was provided with oil, cleaned the wick, and received their weekly thaler. But they became old men, and when one of them grew ill and saw that he was about to die, he appointed that 1/4 of the moon should, as his property, be laid in the grave with him. When he died, the mayor climbed up the tree and cut off 1/4 with the head shears, and this was placed in his coffin. The light of the moon decreased, but still not visibly. When the second died, the 2nd 1/4 was buried with him, and the light diminished. It grew weaker still after the death of the third, who, likewise, took his part of it away with him. And when the fourth was borne to his grave, the old state of darkness recommenced, and whenever the people went out at night without their lanterns, they knocked their heads together. When, however, the pieces of the moon had united themselves together again in the world below, where darkness had always prevailed, it came to pass that the dead became restless and awoke from their sleep. They were astonished when they were able to see again. The moonlight was quite sufficient for them, for their eyes had become so weak that they could not have borne the brilliance of the sun. They rose up and were merry, and fell into their former ways of living. Some of them went to the play and to dance. Others hastened to the public houses, where they asked for wine, got drunk, brawled, quarreled, and at last took up cudgels and belabored each other. The noise became greater and greater, and at last reached even to heaven. St. Peter, who guards the gate of heaven, thought the lower world had broken out in revolt, and gathered together the heavenly troops, which are able to drive back the evil one when he and his associates storm the abode of the blessed. As these, however, did not come, he got on his horse and rode through the gate of heaven, down into the world below. There he reduced the dead to subjection, bade them lie down in their graves again, took the moon away with him, and hung it up in heaven. The Old Woman in the Wood. A poor servant girl was once traveling with the family with which she was in service through a great forest, and when they were in the midst of it, robbers came out of the thicket and murdered all they found. All perished together except the girl, who had jumped out of the carriage in a fright and hidden herself behind a tree. When the robbers had gone away with their booty, she came out and beheld the great disaster. Then she began to weep bitterly and said, "What can a poor girl like me do now? I do not know how to get out of the forest. No human being lives in it, so I must certainly starve." She walked about and looked for a road, but could find none. When it was evening, she seated herself under a tree, gave herself into God's keeping, and resolved to sit waiting there, and not go away, let what might happen. When, however, she had sat there for a while, a white dove came flying to her with a little golden key in its mouth. It put the little key in her hand and said, "Dost thou see that great tree? Therein is a little lock. It opens with the tiny key, and there thou wilt find food enough, and suffer no more hunger." Then she went to the tree and opened it, and found milk in a little dish, and white bread to break into it, so that she could eat her fill. When she was satisfied, she said, "It is now time when the hens at home go to roost. I am so tired, I could go to bed too." Then the dove flew to her again, and brought another golden key in its bill, and said, "Open that tree there, and thou wilt find a bed." So she opened it, and found a beautiful white bed, and she prayed God to protect her during the night, and lay down and slept. In the morning the dove came for her the third time, and again brought a little key, and said, "Open that tree there, and thou wilt find clothes." And when she opened it, she found garments beset with gold and with jewels, more splendid than those of any king's daughter. So she lived there for some time, and the dove came every day and provided her with all she needed, and it was a quiet, good life. Once, however, the dove came and said, "Wilt thou do something for my sake?" "With all my heart," said the girl. Then said the little dove, "I will guide thee to a small house. Enter it, and inside it, an old woman will be sitting by the fire, and will say, 'Good day.' But on thy life give her no answer. Let her do what she will, but pass by her on the right side. Further on there is a door, which open, and thou wilt enter into a room where a quantity of rings of all kinds are lying, amongst which are some magnificent ones, with shining stones. Leave them, however, where they are, and seek out a plain one, which must likewise be amongst them, and bring it here to me as quickly as thou canst." The girl went to the little house, and came to the door. There sat an old woman who stared when she saw her, and said, "Good day, my child." The girl gave her no answer, and opened the door. "Whither away?" cried the old woman, and seized her by the gown, and wanted to hold her fast, saying, "That is my house. No one can go in there if I choose not to allow it." But the girl was silent, got away from her, and went straight into the room. Now there lay on the table an enormous quantity of rings, which gleamed and glittered before her eyes. She turned them over and looked for the plain one, but she could not find it. While she was seeking, she saw the old woman and how she was stealing away, and wanted to get off with the bird cage which she had in her hand. So she went after her and took the cage out of her hand, and when she raised it up and looked into it, a bird was inside, which had the plain ring in its bill. Then she took the ring and ran quite joyously home with it, and thought the little white dove would come and get the ring. But it did not. Then she leaned against a tree and determined to wait for the dove, and, as she thus stood, it seemed just as if the tree was soft and pliant, and was letting its branches down. And suddenly the branches twined around her, and were 2 arms. And when she looked round, the tree was a handsome man, who embraced and kissed her heartily, and said, "Thou hast delivered me from the power of the old woman, who is a wicked witch. She changed me into a tree, and every day for 2 hours I was a white dove. And so long as she possessed the ring, I could not regain my human form." Then his servants and his horses, who had likewise been changed into trees, were freed from the enchantment also, and stood beside him. And he led them forth to his kingdom, for he was a king's son, and they married and lived happily.